Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Boyce, it's great to have you on All Across America.
Thank you, Mark. I'm excited to be here.
You're originally from Connecticut. You live in New Orleans now, just a few blocks from the Mississippi. And you've written a book called The Great River. What drew you to the Mississippi?
Yeah, it's a long story, hopefully not too long, or I'll try and keep it from going too long. But I guess growing up in Connecticut, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. And I thought I read a lot like John Cheever. I thought I'd write about the suburbs because that was my domain, but I was always interested in like, what is the physical world around me? And then after college, becoming a writer is not, there is writer school, but it's not like law school where you kind of go and get the credential and someone's going to hire you, right? You have to find your way. And so I wound up wandering around for a couple of years after college, essentially working in education, working for nonprofits, and eventually landed through that in rural Mississippi, in the region known as the Mississippi Delta, and which is sort of Cotton Kingdom, land where the blues was born. And that's where I began my writing career in earnest. I think that place is such a literary history, and it kind of kicked my butt and said, if you want to be a writer and you're living here, you've got to do it. And so through that, I wound up writing a magazine profile of a man named John Rusky, who is sort of the canoe guide of the lower Mississippi River, which is a crazy river to take tourists out onto because it's so big and powerful. And so I went out with John for 3 days and 2 nights back actually 10 years ago now in 2015. And thought I was just going to write this little dispatch about this guy, but I was so blown away by what I found on the Mississippi River. It was sort of the Delta where I was living is so agricultural, so sort of straight laced, right? Like you can see it in the fields. They're these tight rows. And I went out in the river and like, this is a wilderness. And I hadn't realized how much I was missing wilderness. And so just got obsessed with the river and spent the next 8 years writing magazine stories and eventually this book all about that river, what it is, what it has been, what we've done to it. So.
Yeah, it is interesting to think of the Mississippi River as a wilderness, and I guess it's dependent on where you are along the Mississippi, because as you write about and I've experienced, and I mentioned I used to live in New Orleans, some places you can't see. You could be a stone's throw away from the river and not see it because of the levee, because of retaining walls.
Yes, yeah. So I do live now, you mentioned this, I'm 2 blocks from the Mississippi River. This is the closest, in the 15 years I've lived and been obsessed with, lived in the South, and the 10 years I've been obsessed with the river. This is the closest I've ever been to it on a daily basis. And at night, I can kind of hear the moaning of the big ships going past. But if I walk the 2 blocks from my house, there's a big brick wall because it is the New Orleans port. And it takes me 15 minutes in the car to drive and see this water. So yeah, I think that's one of the challenges actually for the river. One of the things that underlies the many issues that this river faces that we may get into is the way the country imagines it, and that is so shaped by most people are going to see it here in New Orleans. And you go to the French Quarter and you see these big boats going past, or you see it in Memphis, you see it in Minneapolis, where there's real beauty in the river in all those cities, but it's still, you can't help but notice how it's been so industrialized. But that is a really that is the common human experience of the river, but it's actually a misrepresentation of what the most of the Mississippi is. Hundreds of miles you can paddle without seeing a town or a village. You just go through forests. And so it is completely different than the river that most people see for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, and even in New Orleans, I'm just thinking back, you can only see the river in 2 small sections. One is there's a little spit in Audubon Park where you can kind of lay out on the grass there. And then at the south end of Canal Street where they've got all the kind of steamships and touristy stuff. But that's really it, right?
Those are like the official sanctioned places. But one thing I love about the rivers generally is that they're often sort of unsanctioned. It's just like uncontrollable spaces in many different ways, sort of geologically uncontrollable, but legally hard to keep people out of. So, there's a space called the End of the World in the Bywater neighborhood. There's this thing called the Industrial Canal. It's where the canal meets the river, and it's just like an unofficial dog park. And then the batcher is the word that we use down here in the South for the land that is between the levee and the river. And there's quite a bit of batcher kind of above Audubon Park that I don't know who owns it, but nobody really can. Like, you can go and wander around there. And that's one of my favorite experiences in the city, is just to take the dog and walk through these kind of feral woods where you're going to stumble upon weird people, weird things. It's just a strange space. So
yeah. I mean, and you wrote about, just the wildness of it. Even in the state of Mississippi, there's only 4 bridges across the river.
Yes. In the state of Mississippi, I may be biased as someone who lived in Mississippi for 9 years and kind of considers Mississippi, it will always be home to me now because of that time there. But I think Mississippi is where the Mississippi River is at its shines its brightest in some ways, is because it's so rural and historically. I mean, I get into this in the book. That is where in Mississippi and Arkansas and northern Louisiana was where this massive floodplain existed that was so swampy, that was so hard to tame, and for hundreds of years, kind of white settlers were saying like, we want to get in there and build farms because that's the soils that the river brought are so rich, but it was so difficult to do so. And so it's really kind of never, there's a brief flash at the or late 1800s, early 1900s, where people were moving in and building farms, and it's been depopulating since. And so it's always been this sort of region without a whole lot of people. And it really, on the river, you're like, oh, you can see what Mark Twain saw. You can see what people before Twain saw when this river was truly the frontier.
Yeah. And well, maybe we could start at the beginning, the headwaters.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, what to say about the headwaters? It's a funny space for me, right? Because one thing I always try and say is the Mississippi River is so big, right? And there are, in some ways, multiple Mississippi rivers. The lower Mississippi River feels entirely different from the upper Mississippi River, and the dividing line there is sort of the lower river begins in Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio River comes in, where all of these big tributaries are flowed together, right? And there's even a middle Mississippi between Cairo and St. Louis, but the upper Mississippi is. It starts at Lake Itasca in Minnesota and comes down. And so to me, it's not my river. It's not the river that I got to know. It is more stereotypically beautiful in a lot of ways in the north. They're bluffs. You see like cliffs and rocky rocks and water together, which is down here we only have mud. And I was really reluctant for a long time to go to the headwaters, in part because of that lower river kinship, I began to sort of don't believe in the idea of the headwaters, right? I think what makes the Mississippi River what makes it the Great River, as I put it in the title of the book, is that it is drawing on more than 100,000 named waterways, let alone little creeks and sewers and things like that, right? So to try and pick one spot and say, here's where the Mississippi River begins, seems a little bit misguided to me. Rivers are these complex things that are braided and draw so much stuff together. And Lake Itasca, it's a funny name. It's sort of, you would be, a lot of people, I think, probably assume that, oh, that must be one of those Indian names in the same way Minnesota and Dakota and all that is. But it's not. It is a name that was made up by this white guy who was determined to find the source of the river. And it means it's sort of taking the Latin words for true and head and kind of mashing them together. And so to me, it was sort of like, that was doubly problematic. It's both trying to make it this thing that isn't really the true head seem like timelessly the true head in all these ways. But I did go up there while researching the book. It felt like I couldn't write this book about the Mississippi River without seeing it. And I found it incredibly powerful. It's a beautiful, beautiful space. And it was sort of, I don't know, there were all these families that had gone there, and it's not easy to get to. You're, hours away from any kind of real city. And so to see that many people had made this journey to go see this place where water begins, that was really powerful to me. I just walked away from it kind of thinking, I wish we knew that every place in America is a place that a river is beginning, because when the rain falls, it's going to go and join a river, and treated every space with that same respect and care that we treated Lake Itasca.
And, you mentioned all these different headwaters, and of course in Minnesota, but also the Missouri River as well. I mean, stretches into almost Leadville, Colorado.
Yeah, I mean, the Missouri, you could argue, I think maybe I sort of slightly argue this in the book, that the Missouri is the real river in this system, right? Most places, the way we name rivers is you just keep going and saying, okay, at this branch, as you're going upstream, you say, which branch is longer? And you keep following that one. And that would take us, yes, up into the Rocky Mountains in Montana, actually.
Oh, wow.
And so it's, I think, 2,000 miles from the headwaters of the Missouri to St. Louis, where it joins the Mississippi. That's twice as long as the upper Mississippi. But again, this is one of these things where the story of the river and the story of how we talk about geographical space in this country is so colored by political history, right? The Mississippi is the river instead of the Missouri, in part because the powers that be have been sort of white European powers, and the French came down the Mississippi long before they ever saw the Missouri. And so the names just got wrapped up in that. And so the fact that we are so obsessed with the Mississippi and not the Missouri River is deeply embedded in sort of this colonial history of conquest of North America.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to think why. I mean, Mississippi is such a great name.
Yes, that helps too.
I think that's part of it.
Yes, it's such a great word, but.
But yeah, I mean, now that you mention it, I learned from your book that the first bridge over the Mississippi wasn't built until the 1850s.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a hard river to bridge, and even that, I should say, was on the middle Mississippi, right? It was the first bridges were all above the mouth of the Missouri because after it's like the Missouri comes in from the west, and then the Ohio comes in from the east, a little bit below, another couple hundred miles below that, and those both make the river so much bigger. And so when American engineers could finally wrap their heads around the sort of feat of bridging this big river, they still could only bridge the upper Mississippi. And they're like, they were scared about the lower Mississippi River. It took another couple decades. The late 1880s was when Eads built the bridge in St. Louis, which I believe was the first bridge below the confluence with the Missouri. So.
Wow. And so how were people crossing the river prior to that? I mean, the westward expansion for Native American tribes.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to ferry across for the most part. I mean, steamboats as well, right?
Okay.
And so it was, yeah, it's sort of, that's one of the things, that's one of the delights of this project, was sort of peeling back the layers and seeing what still exists of the ancient river on the landscape, but also getting to look at all these historical records and see how the river existed through the years. You know, it was the first frontier. We think of the frontier now being associate that with being out west, but in the late 1700s, early 1800s, right? The Mississippi itself was very wild feeling and like filled with downed trees, and in part not the lower Mississippi, but on the Ohio, on the upper Mississippi, you had sort of rocky rapids, and so it was just this place where people just made their way and had to push boats and invent new kinds of boats to travel on there. It's just pretty incredible what a force of nature it was, and that shaped our history as a country.
And I guess a lot about your book is, I guess, going against nature, taming the wild Mississippi. And can we talk about when the first levee was built? And I guess that's the story of the Mississippi now, as humans came upon it and tried to mold it in their own way.
Yeah, I mean, so I think of the book is in three sections, and the core, like kind of the most narrative section is the middle section of the book, which is kind of the past 200-ish years, this sort of straightforward narrative of what America in particular has done or tried to do to the Mississippi River. And in some ways it precedes America, right? The first levee on the Mississippi River, and a levee, if listeners don't know, is basically this wall of dirt that we build along rivers to try and keep their floods off the land that we want to keep dry. And so the first levee was built here in New Orleans, finished probably in 1720, basically as soon as the French said, yeah, this is where we're going to try and build a village. A difficult spot from the beginning, but they're like, well, the first thing we have to do is build this levee. And it kind of grew in pieces from there. Pretty quickly, most of the river in Louisiana had a levee so that people could, there's sort of a narrow strip of high ground right along the river here, and people wanted to put in sugar farms in particular there, sugar plantations. But further north, right, in that big floodplain I was talking about in Arkansas and Mississippi, levees were being built, but it was such a big floodplain. It's as much as 90 miles wide. It was hard for people to build levees that could effectively protect that space until the late 1800s, right? So it's 160 years after the first levee is built. Finally, it's like kind of ascends through local, like individual people try and build levees. It doesn't work. They try and make these districts so they can collaborate. That doesn't work. And it's not until the 1880s that the federal government says for the first time, fine, we'll get involved in this project of trying to sort of, reclaim this land, is the word often used. And so then this sort of massive levee building project kicked off for the next couple decades that transformed the river and the country too, I think.
And that was the Army Corps of Engineers?
Yes, the Army Corps of Engineers or the Mississippi River Commission, which is sort of these two entities that are deeply interwound and hard to separate. Yeah.
Can you tell folks more about the Army Corps of Engineers and, I mean, what exactly they are and what they do and their relationship to the Mississippi?
Yeah, I think it's fun. Living here in New Orleans, I think almost everyone knows what the Army Corps of Engineers is. So I forget sometimes, especially after reading this book, that it is not an agency that the average American has that much interface with. They don't know that they have that much interface with it, but I think deeply all of us do.
Yeah.
So the Army Corps, I mean, basically the story of the Army Corps goes back to the beginning of the story of the United States of America. During the Revolutionary War, we were pretty shorthanded when it came to people that knew how to build forts and bridges and the kinds of things that you need to build to win a war. And so we wound up kind of tapping into our French allies and saying, hey, y'all, can you send us some of those trained engineers over here? And Thomas Jefferson from the beginning was like, I don't like this. I worry a little bit that like if we go to war again, we're going to need to have this homegrown supply of engineers. And so in his presidency in, I think, 1802, he founded West Point Academy, which we know of as sort of the famous prestigious military academy. But part of West Point initially was also this sort of training program for the core of leadership, and that was going to include high-level mathematics and the other kind of technical disciplines that engineers would need. And so that was the first Army Corps of Engineers. It wasn't very big. It was sort of this elite academy of a dozen or so, cadets there for a while. But then in the 1820s, when there was a Supreme Court ruling that kind of said, oh, the federal government's going to be in charge of navigation on the Mississippi River. And so then the federal government said, well, that means we probably should have an agency that does that work if we're going to do that work. And so they looked around and said, these Army engineers are probably the best suited to do that. So they started getting funding then to make some maps, to start putting in just little small pieces of engineering. And in the 200 years since then, the Army Corps has become, it's basically the federal construction agency. They do all kinds of work all over, but rivers and harbors in particular has always been core to their mission. And it's now this massive bureaucracy, 40,000 people, I think. That may have been several decades ago. It's mostly civilian employees, but it still is sort of run through the military. And so, here in New Orleans, again, we're familiar with it because, we're surrounded by this hurricane protection system that famously failed during Hurricane Katrina, and that is built by the Army Corps of Engineers. So people are really familiar of both our dependence on them and our frustrations when the things that they build aren't working as they're supposed to.
And so you said in the book, the story of a river is a story of its floodplain. And I guess much of the work of the Army Corps of Engineers is to stop there being flooding into that plain. And you talk about what they've done, I mean, in terms of the longest levee in the world, but also in the fact that Louisiana is losing a football field worth of land. I mean, many football fields during the course of this conversation will be lost because of that engineering.
Yeah, probably one. I think it's 100 minutes now, so it depends on how long we talk. But I think we'll lose one football field as we talk, most likely.
All right. Not all right.
Not all right. Not great. Not great. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things I want to say there. So one, again, going back to the levees, like I think the Army Corps is often held up as a villain. And so early on when the book came out, some sort of interviewer asked me, is the Army Corps the villain of your book? And I have come to think of them not as the villain so much as, again, and this is how when I've talked to people within the Corps, this is often how they see themselves. So like, we just do what we're told. Like Congress tells us to do something, we do it. There have been instances, and I detail this in the book, where sort of because their funding depends on having Congress tell them to do stuff, and their position sometimes is to like advise Congress on what to build or not, that they have actively encouraged more building. But in terms of like levees, it's worth noting that, again, until the 1880s, the Army Corps of Engineers did not build levees, right? It had to be the legal position of the federal government is private property is the responsibility of its landowners. And so if you have a flood-prone property, you got to figure that out. That changed in part. I mean, it's again bound up with politics, with sort of plantation, post-Civil War economies. These powerful landowners in Mississippi were like, well, we need protection to build this land. They sort of had the ear of the president in that moment and convinced this giant change of policy that led to this levee construction. And I say all that because to me, again, I see it less as the Army Corps and more of this Western idea or American idea of what is a river, right? And a river, we seem to have viewed it as a country for the past couple centuries largely as a tool that we want to just make it do what we want. And that is two things. Again, it's navigation. We want to send boats up and down it. And that's what the Army Corps did at first. And then starting in those 1880s, it became sort of the floodplain was not seen as part of the river anymore. It was seen as like potential property that we could sever that from the river and build things on it. And so that has, again, radically transformed the river, radically transformed its ecology. And the construction of these levees has, deeply impacted us here in Louisiana because the system is, at this point, it sort of keeps all of the water in the river, obviously. That's the point. But that water holds mud, and that's what built Louisiana, right? Southern Louisiana was made by the river kind of flowing south and then branching out, spreading all over. And if you keep those floods within the river, all of a sudden Louisiana is not rebuilding itself. And so it's kind of the mud is always sinking. There are other issues, right? When you dig canals, when you drill for oil, all these things impact it as well. But ultimately, it's not getting the replenishment it needs. And so that is why we have a severe land loss crisis that is going on here in Louisiana, that it's kind of unsolvable at this point when you add in sea level rise, right? The place where I live is going to disappear over the coming centuries.
And as I learned it, I guess in Environmental Studies 101, and, for people trying to understand, you've got a 2,000-mile long river, and all of the silt from those 2,000 miles and the runoff from those 100,000 named streams came down centuries before man manipulated the river, and would wash over during flooding season the Louisiana itself and what
Yes.
was the coast, and would just year after year would just wash this silt of thousands of miles of river and basically build up the land. And
Yes.
now that silt is just being washed into the Gulf of Mexico, and I guess down at the mouth of the river, and skipping the rest of the coast of Louisiana. And as the ocean rises, land is being lost.
Yes. One thing I'd add, I mean, like, yeah, another important fact about the Mississippi River is that here in Louisiana, it frequently being like every 1,000 years or so, but in geological time, that's fairly frequently, it will change its path, right? And so it'll jump around. That's a big issue that we're dealing with now. Is like, oh, we're holding it in place. If it made that jump, we'd get more land. The other thing, and I can't go, like, there was just a new study that I haven't had a chance to read that deeply yet, but the other issue is just how much mud is in the river, right? The Missouri River is the source of all this mud for the most part, right? It's sort of the Great Plains. It's more erodible. We built giant dams on the Missouri River for the sake of essentially irrigation, sort of for navigation. And so I think they're saying 10% of the amount of mud that we used to get is now coming down the Mississippi River. So even if it wasn't constrained in the levees, I mean, I do think we see there is land building happening in some places where the water is allowed to flow. So it has some land building capacity. But even if we sort of tore down the levees now, it would have a diminished capacity to rebuild the land we're losing because of, again, rivers are these incredibly complex systems, and we just build stuff and say, like, yeah, we could put a dam here. That'll be good for us. And it's really hard to envision all of the rippling consequences of one piece of infrastructure in this giant watershed that is so interconnected.
Yeah, you were mentioning geologic time, and I mean, one of the most fascinating maps from the book, one of the most fascinating maps I've ever seen was the map of the different flows of the Mississippi River, where it looks like, I don't know, a collection of a dozen ribbons, and somebody had just thrown these strands on a table. I mean, there were just, dozens of different routes that this river has taken over the course of geologic time. It's fascinating.
It is, yeah, yeah. And that's just the past 12,000 years, right? It's like the river we know today is, I mean, which is a long geological time, but it's the river we know today is post-glacial, right? But the maps you're talking about, that's what's on the cover of the book, if people want to look that up. And they were created in the 1940s by the Army Corps of Engineers, interestingly, by a geologist named Harold Fisk. And they are a really famous symbol. There's a new book that came out last week by Robert McFarlane, who's one of my favorite writers, called Is a River Alive?, which is exploring more broadly some of the ideas that I think are in my book about, instead of taming a river, we need to think about what rivers want and need. And he uses the Fisk maps quite a bit in that book, thinking about how they reflect sort of the dynamism in rivers and the way they're always changing. And I was talking to someone yesterday who was saying like in some ways that map is a metaphor for your book, right? And I'm like, yeah, I think it captures kind of what I see of even the shape of the book itself. The way I wrote is like, I wanted to be able to shift the way the river shifts because that is so inherent to this river's personality.
It's funny you had mentioned that it's the cover of the book, and I didn't notice it until you just said it now. It's in full color, the cover versus the inset map. But
yeah.
Now that I see it, it is a really cool cover,
and it's even more beautiful in color, right?
Yeah, so. It sure is. We were talking a little bit about the in Louisiana. There's the Atchafalaya River, and I guess that is almost like a pressure valve in a way, where 30% of the river is allowed to be released there.
Yeah. So I mentioned a couple minutes ago, right, the way that the river always has jumped around, and we've been talking about how the delta here in Louisiana, right, this coastline of Louisiana was built by the river going in different directions. So that, like, we use the word tributary more often than distributary, right? So a tributary is a river, right? The Ohio and the Missouri are tributaries of the Mississippi. They come into it, but rivers this large also have distributaries, which are rivers that emerge from that. And so there used to be all kinds of distributaries in Louisiana where the Mississippi would fork apart into smaller bayous. The Atchafalaya is the last major distributary left, in part because it was so big in the era of engineering that people were kind of nervous about plugging it and what that might do. And what started to happen in sort of the 1940s, 1950s is it was getting bigger and bigger, in part because of as a result of some of the engineering that we'd installed. And people began to get nervous. They're like, oh, if this gets bigger and bigger and bigger, we know that Mississippi likes to sort of pick new rivers. It switches into a different distributary. And eventually the engineers realized that's what's going to happen on the Atchafalaya River. It's going to capture the Mississippi, as it's called, which would be really bad for us here in New Orleans, right? The river would get much bigger and the Atchafalaya would get much smaller here. Our port wouldn't work. Our drinking water comes out of the river. It would be below our intakes. And so we have built a structure called the Old River Control Structure. And that Old River is named for sort of a specific site that has always been called Old River that keeps these two rivers in their current ratio. So 70% of the water will stay in the Mississippi, 30% will go down the Atchafalaya, sort of trying to freeze geological time and not let it advance the way that it would on its own. And that in a weird way that we've kind of pushed it along in that direction because of our engineering, and then said, oh no, we don't want that push. We want to stop it.
So if there wasn't that 30% release, we would be losing way more than a football field every 100 minutes.
What do you mean?
In other words, the water is being released down the Atchafalaya River into the larger Atchafalaya Basin. So silt and sediment is washing over the coast in some respect.
Yeah. So what is happening in the Atchafalaya River is we are seeing land building at its mouth, right? And this is part of the story. Like 500 years ago, when Hernando de Soto was the first white person to sort of document the Mississippi River, actually everything, the Atchafalaya River was sort of just emerging as a river, and the sort of marshes along it were, so it was a new delta that was being formed. And even with us sort of trying to freeze things in place, we're seeing that Atchafalaya delta continue to grow. And so that is sort of a good place for land building to happen. So I think that like the radical solution to land loss that we can't and won't ever pursue would be like, let's just let the river shift. And then all of a sudden, I think we'd get even more land, or more water would be more mud, more land building. We would lose more land over here in New Orleans, though. So it's like a very difficult trade-off. But yes, it's if we had closed the Atchafalaya, then there would not be land building there, and there would be land building almost nowhere at this point.
We were talking a little bit earlier about the Army Corps of Engineers, and when I picked up the book, I thought it would be, they would be the villain, and they weren't. And that's like, real kudos to you as an author, because, that could be the easy way out, and making the Army Corps the villain, as they have been in the news, particularly, post Katrina. But there was a quote, it said, Mother Nature is the worst enemy of the world. I mean, do we got to give them a little credit in that, they're trying to tame the untamable?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think the idea of river as enemy, again, may be inherent into our culture, our Western culture. And that's the hard thing. I wish there was a villain, but it's hard to pin down, what is the ultimate source of what I see as a slightly misguided relationship with the rest of the natural world. I talk a lot about rather than humans and nature, which are divided, I like to talk about the more than human world. We're part of this like swirl of other stuff, but that has not been a part of Western culture. And so the Army Corps has just been sort of like the tip of the spear of like, they're the people that enact the engineering consequences of thinking that way. That said, I do think that like deciding to embed our national river construction agency within the military is going to lead to certain kinds of thinking, right? The military is more likely to talk about enemies and waging wars on nature than like if we just said we're going to make the Federal Department of River Construction. It just might allow for more viable metaphors of what we're doing. Yeah. So
I never thought of it that way, but yeah, it makes perfect sense. And Mark Twain, you had mentioned him in the book, and I said to myself, I forget when he passed away, but it's been over 100 years. And I said, guy was a genius. Let's see what he was say about the Mississippi and the sort of foresight that he may have, and he was spot on. He said you cannot tame that lawless stream.
Yeah, I was struck again and again by whenever I went back to Twain in multiple domains about the river, but also about like Teddy Roosevelt, who remains a heroic figure to many contemporary Americans for good reason. He did a lot for public lands, but when you see his wider story and some of the stories that I tell on the river, he's I don't know. He represents certain cultural ideas of masculinity, of male conquest that I'm not totally into. And Twain saw that as well. I sort of it's embedded in a footnote, but he's pretty skeptical of Teddy Roosevelt and all his bear hunting and his like sort of big gun adventures. Which is interesting because I sort of limited my vision of Twain to some of his writings most directly about what pertain to my book. And now we're in this moment where like Twain is right at the center of a lot of conversations again, both due to Percival Everett's great novel James, and this big broad Chernow biography that just came out. And I'm like relearning sort of that he was both a genius and a buffoon. Of he just his personal life and his economic life was not great, and so he was able to see so clearly what was going wrong on the river while living a sort of fumbling life of his own.
Yeah, and he's got there is the Twain Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, not too far from where you're from.
Yeah,
Been there?
I actually the day my release day event last summer was at the Mark Twain house.
Oh, wow.
It's yeah, there's a weird parallel. So Twain grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, along the river, and sort of then eventually found his way to Hartford, Connecticut, and that's where he lived his life. So I grew up kind of going on elementary school field trips to the Twain house, and then found my way to the Mississippi River. So we have this like not that I would compare myself to Twain, but these inverted paths that I think are interesting. And my publicist was like, "Oh, you mentioned Mark Twain a bunch in the book." And so I contacted the Mark Twain house and they would love to do an event. I figure you want to do that online unless you have a reason to be in Hartford, Connecticut. And I was like, "Oh, actually, my mom lives four
Yes,
blocks from the Twain house and I'm going to be up there this summer." So it was really cool. I got to,
That's awesome.
yeah, I had like that event. Multiple of my former English teachers were in the audience. It was a very cool way to get to launch this book. So far from the geography, but in a place that made so much sense for
Yeah,
it
it
and for
does.
me. So
And the steamboats were the early, I guess, not to say precursor to the Army Corps of Engineers, but they really changed they in a man-made way changed the course of the river because they just demanded so much wood for fuel.
yes, yeah, there's some really interesting sort of speculative archaeological work kind of calculating out the impacts of this right, I think some of the boats would need 70 cords of wood a day to move, and so you saw wood yards pop up along the river where people were just like cutting down the trees, and the steamboat, it's like the gas station of the day. You'd stop over and load up cords of wood, but that meant so many riverside forests were ripped out that and those trees sort of hold these very loose soils in place. And so one archaeologist is looking at sort of these old French villages from the late 1700s that are now buried in mud because, and sort of trying to figure out how much of that was due to removing it, which was quite a bit, right? And so but in some ways I see that as sort of minor in comparison to the way that steamboats also changed this country. Like we just wouldn't be the economic superpower we are if we hadn't, in that moment had access to this giant watershed and suddenly found our way to move across it so quickly and reshaping sort of the relationship between far-flung distant cities.
Yeah, and one of the things interesting about steamboats, I guess me, like a lot of other people, only thought of steamboats in the traditional wedding cake layered fashion that, I don't know, would transport people in ball gowns to be able to gamble, but it was also for commerce, for shipping.
Yeah, I mean that's what it was most of all in many ways. I mean I think that that what you're right, like you had not just steamboats too, but they would push sort of giant log rafts where cutting down the forests in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and they'd like create this trap together this wood and push it that way. And so yeah, it was how cotton was getting out of the cotton kingdom to ports. And that's sort of what I'm saying is, yeah, it helped move populations. It helped the Trail of Tears to move as we were sort of forcing indigenous people west. We moved enslaved laborers on steamboats, but ultimately it was, you can't build up this frontier country if you can't move these the sort of goods you're extracting out and move in the supplies to build towns and villages in. And so that's what the steamboats did.
You had mentioned that in order to really see a river, and it's so true about ports or anything involving water, whether it be oceans or interior rivers, that you need to be on the river to see it. And you had paddled, you had said the entire lower Mississippi. you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, yeah. So we the entire lower Mississippi River plus 3 miles. We launched at the very bottom of the Missouri River and kind of came through St. Louis all the way down. So that was this was in 2017. I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, I got into the river by profiling John Ruskey, this canoe guide, who has become a great friend, a mentor. And so the project that sort of the impetus for me writing about him is he had been working for years on what he calls River Gator, which is a mile by mile guide to the lower Mississippi River. It says, like, here's where a boat ramp is. You know, if you get into this town, you can walk a mile and get supplies. And here's a great campsite on this island. And so he had finished that finally in 2017, 2 years after I'd first met him, and said, like, upon finishing this, I want to both publicize it and celebrate that by doing this massive trip starting in St. Louis and do the whole route. Do you want to come? And I had not sold the book yet, but I kind of, again, I was obsessed with the river. I knew I wanted to write a book about it. And I had rearranged my life. I had just become a full-time freelance writer. And so I was like, well, I've got no real obligations. Sure, I will come for 6 weeks and do that. And it was an interesting trip because 4 of us did the whole thing, but there were, I think, 53 people that involved in some way, right? So it's like when we were back in the Delta where John lives still where I used to live, that was sort of his home turf. We had 3 canoes and maybe 25 or 30 people. They were very large canoes, so they could hold a number of people. So we had this like flotilla of 30 people coming down the Mississippi River. Then other sections, there'd be just 4 of us kind of in the wild alone. And so it was cool to meet all these people that cared about the river, but it was also like incredible to spend essentially 6 weeks never going inside walls, sleeping in a tent on sandbars every night, waking up to watch the sunrise, and seeing, again, getting to know the river, not the way it is here in New Orleans, but seeing it in its full power and vitality and wildness out so far from everything. It's really incredible. I mean, if you have the chance to do that, do it. It's incredible is what I would tell listeners. So,
how many miles is it from the mouth of Missouri to the Gulf?
I think it's, oh gosh, this is what I should know, but I think it's 1,100 there. The lower Mississippi River is around 900, and there's another 200 above that from St. Louis. Yeah.
Wow. And so what did you see? And particularly, what did you see in contrast to just somebody standing on land?
Well, interestingly, I think what if I didn't learn to articulate this until subsequent river trips. But I think when you're on the water in the Mississippi River, it can be really powerful, not in seeing, but in feeling, because it's so big, right? And you're just like, oh, you're sensing how much water runs off this continent, and you are being like swallowed by this massive river that can be a mile wide in places. But scenically, I actually find that sitting in the canoe, right, because the river is so big, you're kind of like looking off on each side, and you kind of see the trees in the distance. The lower Mississippi River has very little topography, so you can't see that much sort of spectacular rise. And what I find most sort of energizing on these trips is in the evening, landing the canoe on shore, and then you get on these islands and sandbars, and so you're seeing from land, but not seeing. It's seeing from land that you can only get to if you're venturing in this way. And if the river's low, right, the Mississippi can rise and fall. I think it's 30 feet in an average year or 60 feet in a big year, and so you can get, if the river's a little bit lower, you can get like 20-foot tall sandbar cliffs, these forests rising up. You just get this sense. Someone once compared it to me to being in the Alaskan bush. You're just like surrounded by so much like subtle topography in some ways, but when you're sitting there watching the sunrise, the sunset, it becomes much more apparent. And I just love that experience of landing the canoe and realizing, I am a 2-day paddle from civilization at this point, but at the heart of this industrial river that means so much to the country, but also in this truly wild space.
And you mentioned how struck you were in the difference between the northern Mississippi and the southern stretches, in that there are marinas and yachts and boats in the northern section, whereas the southern section, there's a lot more tugboats, commerce, river pilots.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is plenty of commerce on the upper river too. A little bit less, right? It's sort of it's busiest in New Orleans. Here in New Orleans, we have like ocean-going freighters, which are like it's like a skyscraper tilted on its side, basically. They're pretty intimidating in a canoe. They can't get past Baton Rouge because of a bridge, and then eventually the river would have gotten too shallow anyways.
Huey Long had a lot to do with that, did he not? The
He did, yeah. He sort of wanted to hold that traffic in Baton Rouge and get the economic benefits of the boats being unpacked there. So he's like, I'm going to build a bridge that limits their, yes, very, very savvy. But yeah, I mean, like, actually, I think the like through transportation, there's a lot on the Upper Mississippi River because it's a lot of soybean farms that are going to pass the crop onto these boats and move them up and down. And so it's less that the river isn't industrialized. That's where all the locks and dams are, but more that there is a more long-standing recreational relationship with the river. Water skiing was invented on a lake that's on the Upper Mississippi in Minnesota and Wisconsin, right? So you have these marinas, and it's also because it's more. I mean, like, there's a great scholar named Thomas Royce Smith who's written a couple books about the Mississippi River through its history, and he writes a lot about how the picturesque tradition in America. There are these books about what landscapes are and are not picturesque. And the lower Mississippi River has never been considered picturesque because it's so flat and monotonous and muddy. But you have these cliffs along the river. You have more topography up there. And so it is better suited to our sort of archetypes of what a beautiful river is supposed to be. And I think that's helped people spend more time in recreational vehicles up that way.
And you said there's 200 islands have been created in the Mississippi over the last 60 years.
Yeah, that to me was just a reminder of despite the locks, the dams, and the levees, that it remains untamed, right? Or like that it confounds the human nature divide that I talked about before, because most of these islands are in some ways seeded by our construction. It's often if we put a dike in the river, right? So just a little structure that's meant to kind of make subtle shifts in the way the water flows. Because there's so much sand carried by the Mississippi River, a little bit of sand starts to get captured by that dike, and then it builds up into this whole island. And so it's like, is that natural? Is that synthetic? Like, is that human made? It's hard to tell, but it is a reminder. Like, we didn't mean to build an island. We just meant to build a dike. And the river, because it's always changing, always shifting. It's kind of creating new habitats and new changes through that, which I find to be a powerful reminder of what is not in our control.
Getting down to Baton Rouge, you talked a lot about Cancer Alley, and one of the Huey Long was very savvy, but it also created a lot of industry, which is great for Louisiana, but a lot of also heavy polluting industry.
Yeah. I think there's 200 petrochemical facilities between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, which is funny. It's probably the stretch that I've canoed the most, just because I live here. And when my friend John comes down and needs a hand when he's doing an expedition here, I wind up doing it. And there's some really beautiful stretches on this part of the river too, but it is not where I would recommend spending as much time in a canoe. So these facilities came in for various reasons, but kind of 1940s, the oil industry was emerging. The levees had just been sort of re-strengthened, and then the sugar industry was kind of waning. And so there are these big properties that people were like, oh, this would be a perfect place. We need to refine this oil. We can do it here. We have easy access to all this infrastructure. And it's really reshaped that region in what I find troubling ways, right? And in particular, the oil and chemical companies, they need to build very large facilities. And so the properties they tend to buy will be former plantations, very, very large properties. And between those very large plantations, there are smaller neighborhoods that are like historically Black villages and neighborhoods, right? That was the land that Black people were able to access, just much smaller parcels tucked between the white-owned land. And it's not necessarily an intentional thing, but these oil companies don't need these tiny patches of land. And so all of a sudden, people whose families have lived here for generations that used to live in this very bucolic agricultural area, if dark area because it was slave plantations, but now they're surrounded by massive polluting facilities. And so there's been a big fight over the past decade, several decades really, about, how can those communities gain the voice and the power to say, like, we don't want to be surrounded. We want our homeland to remain clean and unpolluted. And there have been some successes lately, really, some like able to kind of stop new construction in multiple occasions, but also it's a real question of like, is it too late, right? Like, well, how damaged is this landscape already?
I mean, that is, what do you do? I mean, how many Superfund sites must there be between Baton Rouge and New Orleans? And it's almost like, do you just concentrate it in one place and keep it there, or do you spread the wealth into other areas of the state and country? And in some respects, it's almost like, hey, if you already got 200, what's 201?
Yeah, well, and that's the complicated question, and so many things about the river, about like how do we decide who to flood and what to do. Is like someone in so many when you extract and tame nature, there are these sort of externalities and negative consequences, and someone has to suffer them. But when we sort it out with an economic lens and say, well, like we shouldn't put it in the wealthy neighborhood because like that will cause more damage to property values, right? But that means the same people again and again that are suffering those consequences tend to be low income people of color that have fewer recourses to stop it.
And you called it America's mortar, which, particularly at night, and that's what struck me the most, along the Mississippi, but also in, the bayou areas of southern Louisiana. Just seeing these plants lit up at night, it just looks like this UFO hovering above the horizon. It is a very eerie, surreal, creepy sort of view. It's very
Yeah,
strange.
not even UFOs hovering, but like right here we have these facilities in Louisiana often have pipes that are off gassing, right? So they have to they've got waste gases that are a result of the process, and the best thing to do is sort of like burn them. And so there's literally flaming towers. And so I mentioned that I've canoed this strip a lot. At one point, some photographers wanted to get photos of some of these facilities, and if you try and do that on land near the property, their security guards will run you off. So they're like, let's go out on canoe and try to get it from the riverside. And so we'd go lounge in these beautiful island camps all day. And then at sunset, get in the canoe and like try and paddle as close as we could to these facilities. And that's where it really felt, I could feel that menace because it's like dark night sky. And then all of a sudden you see this burst of flame over the top of the levee. And you're really like, what have we done here? This is such a strange way of seeing the landscape, to be sitting in the wildness and looking over this wall at this just grim, dark industrial machine.
And who owns, speaking of being able to paddle right up to these buildings, who owns the Mississippi?
Well, navigable rivers in the U.S. are public property, right? I think that's an interesting thing, and we love public lands here. But I note in the book that sort of one of the first sort of concerted legal decisions that was about like what does the federal government retain perpetual management over was this decision of like, oh, the Mississippi River will be ours. It wasn't because we wanted like beautiful national parks on the river. It was like because the federal government was the one that was going to make sure the river stayed navigable. But that means the river itself, again, like you can go out in a canoe. If you do it in New Orleans, someone's going to yell at you and someone's going to yell at you and say, you're not supposed to be here. But actually, they're saying that because they don't want to deal with the hassle of you being there because they have to defer to smaller craft on the right of way. But the banks get more complicated. I have read some legal papers about this. They're hard to summarize, but basically, above the sort of average high water line, that can be and is mostly private property. So when we do these canoe trips, we are probably technically squatting briefly on other people's land. It's so remote, though. I mean, these tend to be, hunting camps, timber camps that people don't spend that much time in. That we very rarely encountered landowners, and typically when we did, like we camped at some hunting camps where people were like really excited to get to sort of like come. They drive up in their ATVs and say like, we want to show you our lodge, right? Like it is the people that have come to love this river love finding other people that love it. So.
Yeah. And maybe you can describe a little bit about your journey and what the Mississippi is like south of New Orleans.
Yeah, it's actually one of my favorite stretches is south of New Orleans, right? So again, we've talked earlier about the geological construction of the Mississippi, and down here we're really in the Delta. So above New Orleans, again, to reiterate, we have talked about these sandbars, these forests, and things like that. Down here, you get less sandbars because it's much more surrounded by marshland, and so downstream of New Orleans, I mean, there's just a really interesting infrastructure. There's like an old abandoned quarantine station. There's sort of old lighthouses that are, you can kind of, if you can get to them, you can go and explore a little bit in these derelict ruins that I find interesting. But then it's just this flat, it's almost like the prairie on the water, right? It's these endless expanses of marsh grasses filled with birds. And it's just a beautiful landscape. It's funny, in Louisiana, I think if you spend time in sort of the suburban villages, it's not a very beautiful place because we can only manage to live here by building canals that sort of drain this water. To appreciate how beautiful Louisiana is, you have to be in a boat out on the water and seeing sort of
100%.
the lushness of the wetlands and the way the bayous curl around. And so, yeah, getting south of New Orleans, there's still a lot of boat traffic there, but you see this real beauty of what this place really is.
And the last, bridge I was looking over the Mississippi is, I guess, the Crescent City connection in downtown New Orleans, and that's it.
That is it. Yeah, there are. I think there are still a couple ferries south of that. So like, there's like a car ferry that you can drive across. But yeah, it becomes um, get south of New Orleans, and you're kind of on one side of the river or the other. So
That's it. I mean, you got Plaquemines Parish on one side, St. Bernard on the other, and there are 2 roads running parallel, and the twain shall never meet.
exactly. Yeah.
And I've actually driven down to Venice, which I guess is as far south as you can go and along the Mississippi. And there's a little sign there that says, you've reached the southern stretch. And I remember it was a friend and I. We met this guy by the name of Roy DeBrew, who I don't think is with us any longer, but he lived on a houseboat at the very end in Venice there, and he had 2 dogs that went missing, and I guess they were very loud dogs, barked a lot, and I don't know what happened, but we ended up getting brought us into the houseboat, gave us some whiskey, and we just kind of hung out with him for a while. But most of that area is parking lots for people working on the offshore oil rigs for helicopters to pick them up and drop them off. So
Yeah, yeah. I was driving not down to Venice, but last week for a story I'm working on about oyster farming. Drove to another end of the road, basically, right? And I find again driving these where you see driving in rural Louisiana just like feels kind of dusty and dry, and you see all these oil pipelines and raised homes. It's really interesting, but not particularly beautiful again. But then if you can get out and cross that levee, it looks so different. But I think I've experienced what you were saying of just the hospitality. The people you meet down there are so fascinating and often so kind and warm and welcoming, which is really lovely.
It is kind of almost living at the edge of the world and knowing that, I mean, I live in suburban area. I mean, you're in a city, but New Orleans, of course, may not be here a few hundred years from now, but much, much more so for people living, south of New Orleans, and that you're on borrowed time.
Yeah, I mean, some people, I think some of them are past borrowed time, and like a lot of people who live down there have lost homes to hurricanes. But I don't know. There's a certain strain of people that's where they want to be. They know it's always going to be difficult, always going to be precarious, but they love being on those waters. That is home to them. And I think we have a lot. I've learned a lot from meeting those people and saying like, what wisdom comes from embedding yourself in a place, and even as that place is sort of fading and changing, and is always going to challenge you.
Yeah. I mean, I was always fascinated by seeing mobile homes on stilts. They'd be elevated 20 feet into the air, or, of course, the cemeteries, all the caskets are above ground, and, you'll see small infant caskets. It's very interesting, very strange.
Yeah, it's just a different, it's the geology here, right? That we are wet and low, and so we just have to live different. But
What was it like paddling after 1,100 miles and reaching the Gulf of Mexico?
it's a good question. I think in some ways it was like almost anticlimactic. We came down. There's 3 passes, right? The Mississippi River there's mile 0, but it's not the end of the river that we call the Bird's Foot Delta, because if you look at it from above, it looks like a chicken claw. It's got these 3 different sort of narrow rivers pointing out from that. And we went down South Pass down the middle. And that's where some like historic jetties were built. But the nature of this landscape is like it's always liminal, and where it ends, where the landscape ends and the ocean begins isn't quite clear. And so that was part of the anticlimax. Is like you don't quite know when you've finished. But we did go out and kind of passed out of these jetties and found a little island with enough sand to pitch a tent. And it was like beautiful. I remember it was like a kind of grim and windy couple days. We had to stay out there for 2 days. But you'd look back and sort of, you can't tell where you are. You're just like surrounded by grass and water. And so it's this like beautiful, intriguing space. But it's not striking in some way that like there's not some, like, I guess we could have put a planted a flag in the ground, and that's what the French did hundreds of years ago. They put a cross in the ground near there, but it just felt like that doesn't match the what the space is.
And so what do you see in the future? What do you see happening 25, 100, 1,000 years from now?
I feel like 25, yeah, different things on all those timescales. I'll say that. We know that the Mississippi is mostly growing more powerful, it seems like, right? And that's for multiple reasons. But our sort of engineering of the entire watershed is just putting more water in the river. It's growing bigger and bigger. Although, interestingly, the past couple of years, we've had some difficult low water years here in New Orleans that causes its own problems. But I have some concerns over the next 25 to 50 years of the levees have done a lot of damage, but again, I couldn't live where I live without them. And I worry about the state of the levee system, and do we have to build even bigger levees to contain the growth of the river? We know over the next century or so, Louisiana is just going to keep disappearing. There's no engineering that we've been able to dream up that we can slow that down, but we can't stop it. And so I think New Orleans will be here for a while. I like it here. People like it here, but it will become a more and more difficult place as it's essentially sort of like this island at the end of a highway. It's sort of the Venice of the future is New Orleans, maybe. Venice, Louisiana, the end of the road that you were talking about. I saw John Rusky I was talking with the other day, the canoe guide that has meant so much to me. And he would have asked a similar question, and he sort of went on this vision that I think some people might consider dark and misanthropic, but it also has its beauty of he's like, the river's going to win, right? We've got that old river control structure, and it's going to fail one day, and the levees are going to crumble. And, 1,000 years is a long time. Western culture has been on this river for basically 250 years. So we're trying to envision 4 times longer than white people have been around. I'm like, can all the stuff we've built make it that long? The Army Corps of Engineers only thinks in 50-year increments. And when they plan a project, they say what's going to happen in the next 50 years? And they don't look beyond that, right?
Wow.
And so what will survive over that time period? If we have more presidential administrations that don't want to spend money on federal projects, can we maintain all of the engineering that needs to be maintained to keep the river the way we want it? And so there's darkness in that. It means places like the Mississippi Delta, that it's, blues culture, this beautiful and haunting and difficult piece of American history, that would be washed away. Cajun culture in Louisiana could be washed away. But there's something powerful in thinking about the Mississippi River being this thing that's for 12,000 years kind of made this place and ruled over this place. And for the past 200 years, we've been like, no, we're going to rule over this place. And that in another 1,000 years, I think the Mississippi will take it back. And I don't know, there's something just in that. And the question is, how will we as humans figure out how to live alongside it again? Which people did for thousands of years. There were indigenous people that managed that. And I think we can manage it again, but it will be quite an adjustment.
Yeah. Mother Nature is a formidable force.
Yes.
Won't call it an enemy, but it is a force.
Yes. There's a quote in the book that I come back to a lot and talked about the Mississippi River is sort of an unappeasable god, right? And so a god is not an enemy, but it doesn't have to be. I think the Mississippi resists the notion of Mother Nature as this delightful thing that embraces us. You don't live in New Orleans and say oh, Mother Nature is so kind to us.
No.
But it is an unappeasable God that you can't tame. You've got to say okay, how do I reckon with you? And how can we best collaborate you despite your sort of shifting moods and your difficulties? That's what we should be thinking instead of how do we win this battle.
Very wise words. I mean, I think that's the story of the last 250 years. I don't quite know if the leadership of the Army Corps of Engineers has quite been mindful of that, but we'll see.
Yes. Yeah. And again, I don't know that it's just the leadership of the Army Corps to come back to that thing. It's just not. It is not what has been embedded in our culture as a country. It's been we want to own, extract, control, and that's. I see the Mississippi River as sort of a good place to look in the moment of climate change. If climate change is basically chaos, right? And it's always been chaotic here. And so we are sort of the lessons of the Mississippi River, I think, are lessons of the world in large in the years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. It's not a lesson for me or you or anybody. It's a lesson for humanity.
Right. Absolutely.
So how can people find out more about you? What are you working on?
Working on too much these days. I sort of have a book idea in the works. I've done a little bit of reporting on animal agriculture, sort of meat agriculture, and all of its problems. But I find I love eating meat. I think a lot of the journalism about agriculture, especially like animal agriculture, is often written by vegans who I admire deeply. But I'm like, I don't want to write a book that's just like quit eating meat. I'm hoping to find a way to write a book that is like, okay, what has meat meant to us as people? What does it mean to be an animal that eats other animals? And is there value in that? And can we keep doing that in the future in a way that retains what value might exist in that? So that's sort of a theoretical project that I'm trying to keep hacking away at, but I'm also launching, I guess the more direct outgrowth of this Mississippi River book is, landing here in the South and spending so much time exploring this river and discovering that it is sort of this natural resource and like aesthetic resource, a beautiful place that we don't know about. I've also come to realize the South is filled with beautiful nature, but we think of the South really often as sort of a place of pollution and extraction. And so I am launching this fall a magazine called Southlands, which will be a biannual print journal about nature and outdoors culture here in the South. And the idea behind it is like, I want to tell more stories of what is beautiful here, of the ways that people relate to our landscapes, because I think there's value in that. And we need to frame this place as a place that has a lot to love, because love is a powerful motivator for protecting it, and hopefully making it even better. So
100%.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Boyce, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Mark. This has been wonderful. So glad.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.